The Princess of Wales lived her life in public. She couldn't hide from the press if she tried, and she did try. But the public's appetite for details about Diana's life was insatiable. And still, the true story of her life, to a remarkable degree, was secret, until she told the secrets herself on 6 deeply personal audio tapes, the closest thing we'll ever have to her autobiography. Her own story, from an unhappy but privileged childhood to a tragically mismatched marriage. Heard that Diana tried to commit suicide, but tonight you'll hear her describe it herself.
Charles said I was crying wolf, and I said I just felt so desperate, and I was crying my eyes out. And he said, I'm not going to listen, you're always doing this to me. He said, I'm going riding now. So I threw myself down the stairs, bearing in mind I was carrying.
A routine inventory of the attic storage at Highgrove House came to a sudden halt when Prince William uncovered an uncatalogued analog audio cassette hidden inside an antique writing desk. It was early 2026, and as the old tape deck hummed to life, the distinct, unmistakable voice of Princess Diana filled the room. Within minutes, 2 veteran housekeepers who had served the family for 30 years broke down in tears, entirely overwhelmed by what they were hearing. Diana wasn't just reflecting. She was leaving a final explosive message detailing a hidden truth that would leave the modern institution completely paralyzed. This forgotten recording didn't just break the palace silence. It instantly shattered the relationship between the future king and his father, the dust of the Highgrove attics. A heavy wooden crate scraped across the dusty floorboards of the far western attic at Highgrove House. 2 contractors carrying a long ladder stepped around a stack of old oil paintings, clearing space for a mandatory ceiling insulation project. It was a standard Thursday morning in early 2026. In the corner of the room, sitting beneath a small skylight coated in grime, was a small 19th century mahogany writing desk that had belonged to the family since the late 80s. The contractors were instructed to clear the space completely before the structural drilling could begin. While lifting the mahogany desk by its side, brass handles, one of the interior support panels shifted slightly, revealing a narrow, hidden recess behind the bottom document drawer. Inside the dark slot sat a single, uncatalogued analog audio cassette casing made of gray plastic. The label on the front was entirely blank, lacking the standard registration numbers of the Royal Archives. The baseline facts of property audits at the estate are remarkably rigid. Under the Public Records Act, any physical or audio recording created within a royal residence by a core member of the family must be formally registered, digitized, and logged in the central database at Windsor to protect institutional history. This strict framework ensures that private conversations regarding state business are systematically preserved under state law. But this gray cassette had completely bypassed the entire registry network for over 3 decades, remaining totally invisible to the palace legal team. The tension climbed when the estate director carried the plastic casing downstairs to the ground floor library where Prince William was reviewing farm reports. The prince looked at the faded plastic shell, recognizing the specific brand of tape his mother frequently used for her private dictations in the mid-90s. He ordered his security detail to find a working analog player immediately, refusing to let the object leave his sight or be sent to a commercial digitizing service in London. A junior technician managed to locate an old battery-powered cassette recorder in the estate's maintenance workshop. The device was brought into the library, and William placed the fragile tape onto the internal spindles. He pressed the mechanical play button. The machine emitted a sharp, grinding squeal as the brittle magnetic ribbon caught on the internal plastic gears, threatening to snap the fragile tape into pieces. The technician immediately pulled the power plug, stopping the player mid-rotation. The potential loss of the recording created a moment of total panic among the small group in the room. If the tape snapped, the physical data would be permanently destroyed before a single word could be preserved. The prince ordered an immediate block on all incoming estate calls and summoned an independent sound restoration specialist, Peter Morris, from the University of Oxford. The sound specialist arrived at the estate within 2 hours, carrying a specialized toolkit and a modern digital audio workstation. He set up his equipment on the large mahogany dining table, using a set of micro tweezers to manually lubricate the tape spindles and realign the internal magnetic tape path. The mystery of the mechanical failure was resolved within 15 minutes. The internal graphite sheets inside the plastic casing had simply decayed over 30 years of exposure to attic moisture, causing the ribbon to stick to the outer plastic wall. But the physical tape issue immediately opened a far more significant mystery for the household. Peter connected the modified cassette shell to a studio-grade digital converter and pressed play once more. The high-pitched hiss of old magnetic tape filled the room, followed immediately by the distinct, unmistakable vocal cadence of Princess Diana. The audio was remarkably clear, recorded in a closed room, with the sound of rain faintly audible in the background. The first 3 minutes of the recording did not contain personal reflections. Diana began by reading out a specific sequence of dates from the autumn of 1995, listing a series of private meetings that took place at Kensington Palace during the week before her famous television broadcast. She named 3 specific senior courtiers who had arrived at her apartments after midnight, carrying a set of unvetted legal documents that were never entered into the official palace logbooks. The tension in the library shifted completely as the voice detailed the contents of those documents. The princess stated clearly that she was being pressured to sign a permanent non-disclosure waiver regarding the family's private offshore financial structures in exchange for a guaranteed protection detail for her children. The recording proved that the institution had used the physical safety of the young princes as a direct bargaining chip during the height of the separation battle. William sat entirely still in his chair, his eyes fixed on the moving audio waveforms on Peter's digital screen. 2 veteran housekeepers, Sarah Jenkins and Mary Thompson, who had served the household since the late 80s, were standing by the door holding tea trays. As the voice continued to describe the intense internal pressures of that winter, both women quietly set the trays down on a side table and broke into tears, completely overwhelmed by the reality of the voice returning to the room after 30 years. The realization that an internal pressure campaign of this scale had been documented on tape changed the entire nature of the family's historical narrative. The palace had maintained for decades that the security arrangements post-divorce were handled with absolute fairness and institutional balance. Diana's own voice was now flatly contradicting that history, providing a timeline of events that exposed a systematic attempt to strip her of her legal protections behind closed doors. The specialist completed the digital transfer, saving the master audio file onto an encrypted solid-state drive that was handed directly to the prince. The physical cassette was carefully repacked into an anti-static pouch and locked inside the library's main floor safe. The digital file was now a permanent reality, completely immune to any internal palace deletion or administrative suppression. The archive tracking records also confirmed that a secondary file from Buckingham Palace had been cross-referenced with this attic registry number during the standard palace consolidation of 2022. This ledger documented a series of missing personal journals that Diana had kept during her time at Kensington Palace. The presence of this specific cassette in the Highgrove attics suggested that a deliberate effort had been made by a low-ranking loyal staffer to scatter her personal records across different countryside estates, preventing a total seizure of her narrative by the main administrative corps in London. The legal implications of this uncatalogued file immediately rattled the senior solicitors at the High Court of Justice. Under current inheritance laws, any undisclosed evidence that proves institutional coercion or a breach of trust during a historic divorce settlement can be utilized to reopen the financial division of estate assets. If William chose to submit this digital master file to the family's independent legal panel, the entire public relations narrative that the palace had carefully built over 3 decades would collapse under judicial scrutiny. The situation became even more pressing when the estate director noticed a series of encrypted outgoing data pings from the main security console on the ground floor. A network technician confirmed that an automated tracking alert had been sent to a private security server in Gloucestershire, the county where King Charles maintained his primary private office. The King's digital monitoring team had just been flagged that a restricted historical file had been accessed inside the Highgrove perimeter. This sudden digital footprint collapsed the timeline for an internal family discussion. William realized that his father's advisors would know about the discovery before his car could even clear the outer boundary gates of the property. The private legal highway through the estate rules had been breached, forcing an immediate direct confrontation between the heir and the reigning monarch over the voice that had been silenced for 30 years. The clock in the main hall struck 2 in the afternoon. The silence that followed the recording was absolute, a heavy stillness that settled over the entire ground floor of the house. The prince stood up from the table, took the encrypted drive, and walked out toward the courtyard, where his vehicle was being readied for an immediate journey to London. He possessed the exact audio evidence needed to challenge 30 years of institutional history, leaving the senior advisors at Buckingham Palace to face a crisis they never anticipated. The confidential voice from 1995. The vehicle cleared the main gates of the estate, its tires humming loudly on the wet black asphalt of the Gloucester Road. William sat in the rear passenger seat, staring directly at the small blue light glowing on his encrypted solid-state storage drive. He plugged a pair of secure headphones into his tablet, fast-forwarding the digital audio track to the 20-minute mark. The audio file contained more than just recollections of late-night palace meetings. Diana's voice shifted in tone, reading directly from a series of internal diary entries she had compiled between September and December of 1995. The background noise on the track changed slightly, capturing the distinct rhythmic chime of a carriage clock that matched the antique timepiece in her old sitting room at Kensington Palace Apartments. The historical facts of that specific winter are deeply recorded in the public broadcast history. This was the exact time frame when the princess was secretly negotiating the terms of her landmark television appearance with a production crew from the BBC. Publicly, the institution has always maintained that the palace hierarchy was entirely blindsided by the broadcast, possessing zero advance knowledge of her intentions. But the tape William was listening to completely overturned that timeline, establishing that a senior palace cell was actively monitoring her communications weeks before the cameras arrived. The tension in the vehicle tightened as Diana began describing a physical search of her private dressing room that took place on November 11, 1995. She stated that 2 unvetted intelligence operatives, acting under a generic administrative order from the Lord Chamberlain's office, had disassembled her private telephone landline to install a hardwired monitoring terminal. They were looking for the master tapes of her audio journals, entirely unaware she had already moved the cassettes out of London through a trusted driver. William pressed the pause button, his jaw tightening as he looked out the window at the passing Wiltshire countryside. The recording proved that the internal security apparatus of the state had been turned directly against a member of the royal family to secure a tactical advantage in a private marital separation. This went far beyond standard palace politics. It was a systemic breach of the Wireless Telegraphy Act, an offense that carried severe legal penalties under British common law. The prince resumed the playback, focus hitting a new set of names mentioned on the track. Diana directly referenced a junior security officer named David Churchill, who had tried to warn her about the phone taps before being abruptly reassigned to a remote diplomatic post in Belize in early 1996. The palace records had always listed Churchill's sudden transfer as a routine overseas rotation based on his personal request. A deep mystery emerged regarding the survival of Churchill's official logbooks from that period. If the junior officer had kept an independent record of the monitoring orders, those documents would provide the necessary physical corroboration to back up Diana's voice in a modern court of law. Without those logs, the recording remained a powerful personal statement, but one that the palace legal team could still dismiss as historical hearsay or a product of the princess's documented anxiety. William resolved this by using his tablet to access the private database of the Duchy of Cornwall Pension Board. He tracked Churchill's employment history post-1996, discovering that the retired officer had returned to the United Kingdom in 2020 and was currently living in a small coastal village near Sandringham. More importantly, the pension log showed that Churchill was still receiving a monthly supplemental retainer from a private bank account managed exclusively by the King's personal trustees. The resolution of the officer's whereabouts opened a far more critical issue for the current royal administration. The supplemental retainer was tied to a permanent non-disclosure agreement that was scheduled to expire in late 26. Charles's legal team had been quietly paying for Churchill's silence for over 3 decades, using private family wealth to keep the physical logbooks from ever reaching a public archive or a parliamentary committee. The car turned onto the M4 motorway, speeding up as it headed directly toward London. William called his personal solicitor, instructing him to issue a formal witness summons for David Churchill under the provisions of the Tribunals, Courts, and Enforcement Act. The prince was not going to wait for the non-disclosure agreement to naturally expire. He was using his independent legal authority as a duke to force the retired officer to turn over the original logbooks to a secure judicial repository before the weekend. The reality of the audio evidence was completely fracturing the traditional historical narrative maintained by the household. For 30 years, the palace had successfully framed the chaotic events of the mid-90s as a balanced, mutual disagreement between two individuals. Diana's voice, backed by the impending recovery of physical security logs, exposed a massive, highly organized institutional campaign designed to neutralize her public influence through illegal surveillance. The phone in William's pocket vibrated with an incoming secure text from his father's private secretary at Clarence House. The message stated that the king had been fully briefed on the network alert from Highgrove and was requesting an immediate, private dinner meeting at his London residence the moment the prince arrived in the capital. The tone of the message was formal, but the sudden request indicated that the main administrative corps was in a state of total panic. William ignored the message, refusing to confirm his arrival time or his itinerary. He needed the physical logs from Churchill in his possession before any face-to-face meeting with his father took place. He instructed his driver to bypass Clarence House entirely and head straight toward the secure legal chambers near the Royal Courts of Justice, where his legal team was already assembling to handle the incoming evidence. The rain began to fall again as the vehicle entered the outer suburbs of London, the wipers making a rhythmic, clicking sound against the windshield. The city felt entirely cold and gray under the afternoon sky. The prince leaned back against the headrest, listening to the final minutes of his mother's voice, knowing that the contents of the file on his lap would permanently alter the family's public standing, leaving the modern institution to face a historical reality it could no longer hide or control. The palace staff's secret oath, an old brass key scraped inside the rusted padlock of a tin trunk in the basement of Marlborough House. Margaret Sullivan, a retired wardrobe mistress who had served the family for 34 years, pulled open the heavy lid. The air downstairs smelled of damp wool and old camphor. It was 4 p.m. Inside the trunk, underneath a stack of ceremonial livery coats, lay a bound leather logbook from 1996. The logbook contained a handwritten list of names, dates, and times, tracking every late-night visitor to the princess's private quarters. Margaret had kept this record completely hidden from the official palace archives. She knew the institutional security logs were systematically destroyed or altered every 5 years to protect internal privacy. This book was her insurance policy, a physical record of the events she witnessed firsthand. The structural facts of royal household contracts are exceptionally rigid. Under the Official Secrets Act, all staff members are required to sign a lifelong confidentiality agreement before they touch a single piece of royal property. This legal framework prevents former employees from publishing private journals or discussing internal family conflicts with the press. The Crown holds absolute copyright over anything created or recorded inside a royal residence. But Margaret's logbook was a private diary of her own working hours, a legal distinction that created an immediate loophole. The tension within the basement flared as 2 plainclothes security officers from the Royal Protection Command arrived at the outer door. They did not have a standard warrant. They carried an administrative recovery order signed by the resident palace governor, demanding the immediate surrender of all uncatalogued estate documents. The hierarchy in London had tracked William's movements and was trying to intercept the physical evidence before the prince could secure it. Margaret did not hand over the trunk. She pointed to a framed photograph on the wall showing her receiving the Royal Victorian Medal from Queen Elizabeth II. She reminded the officers that her current residence operated under a specific grace and favor lease that could only be revoked by a direct, personal decree from the reigning monarch. The administrative recovery order was legally useless inside her home. The mystery of how the palace knew the physical logbook existed after 30 years emerged immediately. A network scan of the estate's local communication lines revealed that a retired butler had sent an encrypted email to a security coordinator at Buckingham Palace just an hour after the tape was found at Highgrove. The veteran staff network was actively monitoring the situation, splitting its loyalty between the memories of the past and the authority of the current king. William arrived at the side entrance of Marlborough House himself, accompanied by his personal solicitor. He walked down the basement stairs, his boots echoing on the concrete steps. He did not ask Margaret to break her traditional oath to the crown. Instead, he presented a formal legal request from the Duchy of Cornwall Archive Board, officially incorporating her private logbook into his personal estate files. This move instantly blocked the palace security team from seizing the trunk. Under property law, an item officially accepted into the Duchy archive is legally protected from generic crown recovery orders. William had used his wealth and legal status to build a wall around the evidence, ensuring that Margaret's entries were safe from any institutional destruction or archival suppression. But the logbook ownership immediately opened a far more dangerous question for the household. William opened the first page of the bound leather book, his eyes finding an entry dated November 12, 1996. Margaret had recorded the presence of a senior medical official who had arrived at the apartments with a locked pharmaceutical case, accompanied by 2 palace trustees. The name written in the margin was Sir John Batten, the late physician to the Queen's household. The entry proved that a formal medical team had been brought into the private apartments during the finalization of the divorce settlement, entirely outside the knowledge of the princess's personal doctors. The recording Diana left matched the logbook dates perfectly, creating an undeniable chain of physical corroboration. The realization that a secret medical intervention had been documented by a staff member caused an immediate wave of distress among the older employees. Several veteran housekeepers who were present in the building during those years began to congregate in the lower gallery, their faces tight with anxiety. Many of them had maintained an absolute silence for 3 decades, honoring an oral promise made to Diana to protect her files if the institution ever tried to rewrite her history. The logbook further itemized explicit security codes used by the Night Patrol at Kensington Palace during the critical transitions of 1997. These alphanumeric stamps were matched to vehicle movement records that were entirely deleted from the state's public transport archives during the routine standardizations of the early 2000s. The legal departments at Whitehall were instantly alerted when William's private network terminal began logging these deep, archival cross-references. If the prince integrated these operational night logs into the active Duchy database, they would immediately become vulnerable to discovery requests from parliamentary transparency panels currently reviewing crown expenditure laws. The situation tightened when an administrative desk officer inside the Lord Chamberlain's office noticed a sudden, unauthorized data export from the old personnel registry. The file history showed that a clerk had quietly pulled the employment histories of every security officer assigned to the royal palaces during the final 2 years of the divorce proceedings. The internal infrastructure of the household was actively supplying information to William's legal team. This revelation verified the true scope of the crisis. The hidden notebook Margaret Sullivan preserved was not just a collection of domestic dates. It was the master framework that connected the anonymous signatures in the canvas files to actual physical identities. The palace could no longer claim that the midnight visits were routine administrative matters conducted by unvetted advisors. William stood in the upper hallway, holding the digital tablet that displayed the scanned pages of the logbook alongside the audio file waveforms. He knew that the combination of his mother's voice and Margaret's physical records formed an airtight legal weapon. He instructed his driver to prepare the vehicle for the final destination of the afternoon, the private study at Clarence House where his father was waiting. The clock on the library tower struck 5. The security officers who had attempted to recover the papers left the building, their mission a complete failure. The circle of absolute secrecy that the palace had maintained since the late 90s had collapsed, torn apart by a retired employee's private diary and the decisive legal maneuvers of the future king. Charles faces. The audio evidence. The heavy rain outside the high-arched windows of the private study at Clarence House turned the view of the mall into a gray blur. King Charles sat in his high-backed wing chair by the fireplace, his reading glasses propped on the bridge of his nose. He didn't look up when the heavy mahogany door unlatched. Prince William walked in alone, carrying a secure digital tablet and a compact pair of studio speakers, which he set down directly onto his father's writing desk. The physical setting of the room was rooted in generations of royal administrative history. This was the exact workspace where the king handled his daily red boxes and reviewed state documentation before it reached Parliament. The shelves around the walls were lined with bound constitutional treaties, personal diaries, and historical ledgers dating back to the reign of King George VI. But the atmosphere inside the study was completely stripped of its usual bureaucratic rhythm, replaced instead by a tense stillness. William didn't offer an introductory greeting. He connected the digital tablet to the speakers with a thick auxiliary cable, his fingers moving with a cold, deliberate precision. He looked at his father and stated clearly that he had recovered both the uncatalogued tape from the high attics of Highgrove and the supporting physical logbooks from the tin trunk at Marlborough House. He pressed his thumb against the screen, initializing the audio playback file at the 25-minute mark. The high-pitched metallic hiss of analog tape transfer immediately vibrated through the quiet room, a raw and textured sound that contrasted sharply with the modern audio equipment. A second later, the voice of Princess Diana echoed through the study. The vocal cadence was unmistakable, carrying that familiar, deliberate softness that the British public had memorized during the mid-90s. The recording captured her sitting in a closed room, her voice tracking a sequence of events from November 12, 1996. The tension in the study spiked to an unbearable level as the voice began addressing Charles directly. Diana was not reading from her standard personal diaries. She was narrating a specific private confrontation that had taken place inside her sitting room after the official separation papers had been finalized by the High Court solicitors. She detailed a precise verbal agreement that had been made regarding the future educational and emotional management of her two young sons, a protocol that completely contradicted the official statements later issued by the palace press office. Charles sat entirely motionless, his hands gripping the carved wooden arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. He did not attempt to interrupt the audio file or instruct his son to turn off the machine. His eyes remained fixed on the dancing green indicator lights of the studio speakers as his late wife's voice described the exact words he had used during that midnight meeting 3 decades earlier. The historical facts of that specific era were a matter of public ledger entries. The institution had always maintained to Parliament that all arrangements regarding the young prince's upbringing, post-1996, were executed with total transparency and mutual institutional consent under the oversight of the late Queen. But the tape provided a completely parallel reality, showing that a series of private, unvetted conditions had been imposed on Diana's household through the strategic use of her physical protection detail. Diana's voice on the recording specifically detailed how her access to her children had been systematically tied to her compliance with certain private financial structures managed by the Duchy of Lancaster. She stated that if she chose to challenge the internal allocation of those offshore funds in a public court, her security detail would be instantly withdrawn under an administrative order from the Lord Chamberlain's office. The institution had effectively used her physical safety as an ongoing lever to protect its private wealth from external legal scrutiny. A deep mystery emerged as the recording moved toward its final 5 minutes. Diana referenced a specific signed declaration that she had forced one of the senior palace trustees to initial before she agreed to vacate her apartments at Kensington Palace. She stated that this declaration was hidden inside a private blue velvet jewelry case that she had personally deposited into a secure banking vault in central London just days before her fatal journey to Paris in 1997. The presence of this secondary physical declaration was an absolute revelation to the current administration. If such a document existed outside the palace archives, signed by an official trustee of the Crown, it would provide the necessary legal foundation to invalidate multiple modern property reorganizations that Charles's legal team had executed over the past 2 years. The institutional vulnerability was immediate, real, and legally binding under current property statutes. William paused the audio track just as the tape hiss returned to the speakers. The silence that followed the voice was heavy, a suffocating stillness that settled over the entire desk area. The prince looked at his father and demanded a full, unmediated explanation regarding the existence of the blue velvet case and the identity of the trustee who had signed the Midnight Declaration. He was no longer acting as an heir waiting for a traditional transition. He was acting as a prosecutor, holding the master key to the family's historical secrets. The king finally took off his reading glasses, his hands visibly shaking as he placed them onto the leather desk mat. He did not deny the validity of the recording or claim that the audio had been manipulated by outside technicians. He looked at his son, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that lacked its usual public authority. He admitted that the declaration mentioned on the tape had indeed been signed by his former private secretary, Sir Richard Aylard, during the height of the institutional panic surrounding the separation. Charles opened a small, hidden wall, safe concealed behind a framed landscape painting by the fireplace. He did not pull out a collection of jewelry. He took out a weathered, key-operated security deposit box bearing the logo of a private bank on Fleet Street that had been closed since the early 2000s. He placed the metal box onto the table and pushed it toward his son, along with a small brass key he kept attached to his personal watch chain. The king stated that the box contained the original signed declaration from 1996, which his legal team had quietly recovered from the bank vault shortly after the funeral in 1998. They had never destroyed the document because they feared that a duplicate copy might exist in the hands of Diana's international executors. The palace had spent 28 years keeping the paper in absolute isolation, hiding it from the public, from Parliament, and completely from the princes themselves to prevent a catastrophic challenge to the crown's private estate rules. But the document's location immediately opened a far more dangerous institutional crisis for the current reign. By handing the box to William, Charles was formally acknowledging that the conditions under which the family wealth had been managed for 30 years were built on a foundation of systemic coercion. The leverage had shifted entirely into the hands of the heir, leaving the king with absolutely no room to maneuver before his own council advisors. William took the brass key, inserted it into the lock of the metal deposit box, and turned it until the lock mechanism cleared with a sharp clack. He lifted the lid, his eyes finding the yellowed vellum paper resting inside, bearing his mother's distinct signature alongside the official crown seal of the trustee. He closed the lid, picked up his digital tablet and the speakers, and prepared to leave the room, knowing that the historical narrative of the House of Windsor had been permanently broken in the span of a single rainy afternoon. The inheritance shift. The weathered security deposit box sat open on the corner of the mahogany desk, its internal felt lining faded to a pale gray. Prince William lifted the yellowed vellum document from the metal compartment, his eyes tracking the dark ink of Sir Richard Aylard's signature next to the official crown seal from 1996. King Charles remained seated in his wing chair, his gaze fixed on the dying embers of the fireplace as the rain continued to beat a steady rhythm against the glass panes of Clarence House. The physical confrontation was over, replaced now by the cold reality of a binding administrative realignment. Under the explicit terms of the newly recovered declaration, any private funds from the Duchy of Lancaster that had been utilized to monitor or restrict Princess Diana's independent household were legally classified as an unauthorized diversion of Crown capital. Under the strict provisions of the Crown Estate Act, this specific classification meant that the current administration was required to immediately restitute the equivalent value directly into the independent estate of her heirs. The baseline facts of the royal family's private asset distribution are tightly governed by a historical framework established in the late 20th century. When the original divorce settlement was finalized, the public was led to believe that the financial terms were entirely clean and permanent. In reality, the document William held proved that a shadow balance sheet existed, one that allowed the palace to systematically reclaim capital through hidden clauses tied to her physical protection detail. By bringing this document into the light, William had effectively invalidated 30 years of estate consolidation projects. The tension shifted from historical grievances to immediate governance as William laid out a newly drafted administrative charter onto the desk mat. He stated flatly that his office would not wait for a formal probate review or a parliamentary committee to process the restitution. He demanded an immediate, total transfer of the management boards for both the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall into a single unified oversight council that would be controlled exclusively by his own financial team. Charles did not offer a verbal defense or call for his private secretary to negotiate a compromise. He took his fountain pen from the desk stand, his hand completely steady now that the hidden truth had finally been brought to the surface. He signed his name at the bottom of the administrative charter, officially surrendering his unilateral control over the family's private wealth and cementing a permanent shift in institutional leverage toward his heir. The mystery of how this massive transfer would be hidden from the public eye was resolved within minutes. The charter contained a specific legal provision that categorized the restructuring as a routine digital modernization project under the Sovereign Grant Act 2024. The public accounts would simply show a consolidation of administrative offices designed to reduce operational costs, while the true reality, a total structural surrender of the king's private financial power, would remain completely buried within the locked vaults of the estate registry. But the financial board control opened a far deeper emotional reality for the remaining members of the household staff. As William walked down the grand staircase of Clarence House, carrying the digital master files and the physical deposit box, several elderly domestic workers stood in the lower gallery in absolute silence. They had spent decades guarding the secret of that winter in 1995, carrying the weight of an institutional battle that had finally reached its ultimate historical resolution. The prince walked past the portraits of his ancestors lining the walls, heading out toward his waiting vehicle in the damp courtyard. He had used his mother's forgotten voice and the preserved logbooks of the palace staff to execute a precise, flawless administrative correction, ensuring that the legacy of the princess was no longer a tool for institutional leverage, but a permanent, unassailable anchor for the future of the monarchy. The recovery of Princess Diana's forgotten recording has permanently shattered 30 years of carefully managed palace history, leaving King Charles to face an absolute structural surrender behind closed doors. By utilizing the physical evidence preserved by the loyal household staff, Prince William has successfully redrawn the financial map of the House of Windsor, securing total leverage over the future of the monarchy. Was the prince right to use these hidden family secrets to force an immediate administrative coup? Or should these historical recordings have remained locked away in the Highgrove attics?